The night shift at a Cold War research program didn't end with a bang. It ended with silence, somewhere between one stamp page and the next. The administrative record stopped midstream, as if the paper itself had run out of time. The systems were still running power, lights, even the lab's basic telemetry, but the document trail didn't just slow down. It cut off. One day the archive was full of progress reports, equipment logs, and routine approvals. The next, the same filing cabinets held nothing but gaps, and the staff remembered a different kind of event. Not an experiment gone wrong, but files that vanished while the building remained intact. At first, people blamed a bureaucratic hiccup. These programs were giant mechanisms, and mechanisms break in predictable ways. A missing signature could delay a transfer. A clerk could misroute a box, but the discontinuity was too precise to be accidental. The last entry belonged to a date that appears in public schedules, and yet the supporting correspondence, those emails, memos, and internal justifications never survived the transition to the next stage. Even the inventory sheets, normally repetitive and boring, stopped reflecting the same containers, the same codes, the same storage areas. It was as though the program had continued operating, while its history was erased in real time. In the late Cold War, secrecy didn't merely hide results. It fractured processes. Teams worked under compartmentalized permissions, where one group could execute the science and another group control the paperwork. That meant the official record was never a single river. It was a braided set of streams, each one dependent on security clearance, administrative jurisdiction, and the political mood of the month. When tensions rose, what was safe to document could change overnight, and what was previously permitted might become contraband for retention. The paradox becomes clearer when you look at the handoffs. Researchers described normal lab activity continuing after the cutoff, but the documentation that would prove continuity, procurement receipts, safety assessments, and verification reports doesn't surface in later audits. Those later audits exist, and they're surprisingly thorough. They list what should have been there, and they mark it as absent. Yet they don't explain how an absence occurred across multiple departments without leaving the usual traces of error. The official record ends here. What happened next was never explained, not in a statement, not in a correction, and not in a purge order that historians can point to with confidence. Cold War secrecy also trained institutions to be plausible. When something is missing, an organization prefers a story that fits within its legal and bureaucratic comfort zone. Misplaced documents, destroyed copies due to a facility incident, routine declassification mishaps, but the timeline refused to cooperate with those narratives. The deletion didn't look like a fire, because there were no scorch marks, no partial recoveries, no damaged but salvageable fragments. It looked like a choice made at the level of access. And when access is the lever, you don't get randomness, you get pattern. Archival pattern is exactly what investigators noticed when they cross-checked one set of internal identifiers against public references. Some identifiers reappeared in later years, as if the program's outputs were still being acknowledged. Yet the raw pathway, the documentary trail that should connect the acknowledgement to the original work, was hollow. That mismatch is the heart of the mystery. How can later systems recognize something that the earlier records swear never existed? The surviving explanation, offered by overworked administrators and cautious officials, is that procedures changed and records were reclassified into storage categories that the public archive no longer indexes. But reclassification usually leaves a breadcrumb, a transfer log, a new catalog label, a reason for moving. In this case, those breadcrumbs are missing too, as if the system could point backward to the cutoff date but refuse to point forward beyond it. At ISN, simply secrecy. It's bureaucratic fracture, where multiple offices hold pieces of the truth and none of them can or will assemble them into one coherent narrative. So the lights went out in the archive, not in the lab, and the files disappeared without the normal signatures of disappearance. The building stayed illuminated. The history didn't. And until someone can reconcile the documentary gaps with the operational evidence, the missing records event remains more than an administrative problem. It becomes a documentary paradox that still pulls at the edges of the accepted story. right as we move into the next set of inconsistencies. Imagine the discovery not as a published breakthrough, but as a stack of everyday documents that should agree with each other. In many famous cases, the lab notebook, the primary record of measurements, dates, and mistakes, acts like a fingerprint. Published papers are cleaner, more polished, sometimes even streamlined. Correspondence with colleagues sits somewhere in between, with half-finished interpretations and quick clarifications. When those three forms of evidence don't line up, it's not proof of one grand conspiracy. It's a signal that something in the chain of understanding has been altered, omitted, or quietly reframed. The pattern usually starts small. A notebook entry references a calibration run that no later paper mentions. A graph in the original notebook uses a different baseline correction than the figure reproduced in print. The methods section claims a particular reagent or instrument, yet the notebook pages show substitutions made on the fly, recorded with frustration rather than optimism. Even the handwriting can matter. Sudden changes in the density of notes, or blank spaces where expected context should be, can indicate a draft that was revised after the fact, or a log that was filled in later to match an outcome. Then there are letters, emails, didn't exist for older work, but handwritten correspondence did the job. Colleagues would ask, almost casually, why did your results shift after the second run? Or did you switch protocols when the detector drifted? In a healthy archive, those questions map cleanly onto published explanations. In these contradictions, the correspondence often describes hurdles that the final account smooths over, while the final account includes steps that peers never heard about at the time. One historian's nightmare is when the published discovery reads like it had a straight line, but the internal documents show a detour. A notebook might show multiple failed attempts before the successful version, while later official summaries present a single clean breakthrough date, as if the team never learned anything the hard way. Or the opposite, the official narrative insists the team used a certain method, yet the early pages record a different technique entirely, with key parameters written down in a way that suggests the authors knew it mattered. Sometimes the discrepancies can be mundane, data loss, instrument upgrades, or an editor's demand for clarity. But the mismatch between primary and secondary sources gets sharper when entire methodological details vanish without any note of revision. If the lab notebook contains the missing parameters, but the published paper replaces them with generic language, the omission isn't neutral. It changes what future researchers could replicate, and it changes what we can responsibly infer about how the result was achieved. The most unsettling part isn't that a published paper differs from a notebook. Scientists revise, summarize, and sometimes protect proprietary constraints. The unsettling part is when the official record claims methodological certainty while the internal record shows uncertainty, improvisation, or contingency, and when the contemporaneous letters appear to bridge that gap, yet refuse to fully explain it. It's like watching a map drawn after the fact, with streets renamed, landmarks removed, and compass directions that don't quite point to the same place. And so, when we compare these layers, raw notes, human correspondence, and later official accounts, we're not hunting a single smoking gun. We're tracing how knowledge is packaged, who had the ability to edit the package, and what context may have been trimmed away. The contradiction doesn't answer the mystery by itself, but it tightens the question, and it prepares the next inconsistency we'll have to face in the records, because the official story isn't just incomplete. It behaves as if it learned to look backward. Imagine a physical object that, under the right instruments, should lock a date into place. Now imagine that the object's own paperwork can't agree with itself about where it came from when it was first handled, and which measurements were taken before the context could be contaminated. That is the shape of a particular kind of scientific mystery, the artifact that refuses to stay where history put it. In the early reports, the find is described with confident precision, as if the provenance were as solid as the material composition. The first custody record places it at a particular site, recovered by a named team, logged under a catalog number with a clear chain of ownership. But when later researchers attempt to reconstruct the trail, the documentation begins to fray. A transport log ends a day earlier than the lab S arrival stamp. A field tag is present in a photograph. Yet the catalog number on the lab invoice doesn't match the catalog number in the archive inventory. These aren't dramatic disappearances. They're bureaucratic gaps, the kind that look minor until they touch the very measurements meant to stabilize the conclusion. The artifact itself becomes the battleground. Its dating rests on a method that depends on controls, a calibration curve, a background correction, an error estimate tied to the conditions under which the sample was prepared. The published record offers results, but the procedural details are strangely summarized. When internal notes are sought, they sometimes show a different measurement strategy than what the paper claims. In some cases, the lab notebook includes extra runs and failed calibrations that never appear in the final text. In other cases, the notes indicate that the sample preparation was adjusted because the material behaved unexpectedly, but the later article treats the preparation as routine. This is where the limits of measurement matter. If an artifact S age estimate sits near the boundary of an instrument S strongest reliability window, then small changes in handling, storage environment, or even contamination risk can push results toward an alternate interpretation. A fraction of a percent ISNT, a fraction of certainty. It's the difference between consistent with and incompatible with the timeline the official record wants. And when the custody gaps are real, when there is no full log from excavation to analysis, those small errors stop being mere technicalities. They become openings. Correspondence can look like a bridge and still fail to deliver. Letters from the period sometimes reference rechecking and relabeling, as if the artifact had to be made to fit the narrative of proper handling. Yet the letters also use careful vagueness. No exact parameters, no clear explanation of why the chain of custody changed, and no admission that the certainty in the published account required a later alignment of records. It's the classic pattern of scientific documentation under pressure. Confidence in the public claim, uncertainty preserved or displaced inside private memory. So the artifact doesn't simply contradict itself. It creates a practical problem for anyone trying to reproduce the reasoning. If a sample S identity can't be verified at every step, the measurement becomes inseparable from the handling story. And if the handling story is stitched together retrospectively, then the dating, no matter how precise the instrument appears, may be anchored to a provenance that never was as clean as it is later described. That's why the artifact refuses to stay where history put it. Not because it moves physically, but because the record that should immobilize it can't hold its shape. Next, we'll look at how researchers respond when verification is incomplete, what they can test, what they can't, and how the same evidence can be made to point in opposite directions depending on which missing details you're allowed to assume away. When the official story relies on a chain of custody that has holes, the science stops being a straightforward measurement and becomes an argument built on missing links. Incompatible with the timeline ISN, only a problem of dates, it's a problem of method. What counts as verification, and who controls the record? That's the uncomfortable takeaway. Before we celebrate a breakthrough that changed everything, we should ask whether the paperwork that anchors it is complete, and whether the uncertainties were preserved honestly or rearranged. If you want the next layer of this case, like and subscribe, and drop your thoughts on what evidence should be non-negotiable.